Welcome to The Teaching Curve, a podcast exploring the pedagogy of global politics and international studies. Produced under the auspices of the innovative Pedagogy initiative of the International Studies Association and made available through the Professional Resource Center of ISA's website. I'm Jamie Free, Professor of Global Politics and Director of the Center for Engaged Learning at Bridgewater College. Each episode of The Teaching Curve is a conversation with a thoughtful and innovative teacher of international studies. The goal is to celebrate and inspire pedagogical creativity in a discipline that is particularly well suited to engage and empower students as academics and as agents in communities ranging from the local to the global. The conversations are intended to humanize processes of teaching and learning through the stories of learning to teach. Most of us are not taught how to teach IR. Doctoral programs seem to assume that having learned the discipline, we will know, perhaps through osmosis, how to teach it to others. The result is that learning to teach global politics often happens as we do it, which is inefficient and often awkward, but often produces great results as well. Today's conversation is with Dr. Cristina Inoue, Associate Professor at the Institute for International Relations at the University of Brasilia. Cristina teaches both undergraduate and graduate students and is currently working to integrate pedagogy into the training that doctoral students receive there. She's a former president of ISA's Active Learning in International Affairs section and is currently a member at large on its governing council. Cristina eloquently describes the need to contextualize the teaching of theory, the ability of thoughtful pedagogy to empower diverse voices in the classroom, and techniques for bringing metacognition about teaching and learning into graduate courses. So, Cristina, welcome to The Teaching Curve.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I think it's a great idea.
So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about, first of all, the university and the institute, and the students. But then I want you to tell us a little bit more about how you learned to teach.
Okay. All right. So how did I learn to teach? I think I'm still learning. I think, it's an eternal learning curve because I think as time goes by, I realize that I still have something to learn about teaching. So I think constantly changing. So you want a little bit of context, right? So I teach international relations at the Institute of International Relations, University of Brasilia. There we have an undergraduate program. We have around 400 students, and we also have a graduate program with around 100 students. And for my undergrads, I teach international relations theory and global environmental politics. And for graduate students, I teach also international relations theory and a new course called Planet Politics and Anthropocene. That's what I teach. And but international relations theory I've been teaching for forever, since I started as right after I was hired, I started teaching international relations theory. So I can see a lot of how much I changed it, because how I started and where I am right now is completely different. Even though the content's more or less the same, the way I teach has changed.
I'm very interested in how you describe that process of changing as a teacher.
Yeah. First of all, I think, as you said, in terms of content, I think more and more realize how much contextual teaching is and how international relations different, looking from different contexts or different places and different institutions and all that. So one thing that has been changing is this realization of contextual factors and how much they matter. Like this whole thing on teaching from the global south or looking from the global south. I think that's one thing that has changed in terms of, even though I still teach the classics, like because I teach international relations theory one, so it's just saw this about the end of Cold War or even the Cold War, international relations, all that. I think we have to take the canons of like Morgenthau or Waltz or whatever. But I think the way I present in a different gaze, like looking in a different way than I used to look in the beginning. I
Mhm.
think that's one change. But also this um, the way I teach has also changed a lot. Like I tried to introduce more visuals. Like my first classes, I think I did this on ISA when exercise of my first class is showing pictures to my students first to see how they perceive international relations. So I start dialoguing from there. I think that has changed since the beginning. But also, I think I was a much harder, like, professor in the beginning. In the beginning, I thought there was this thing on, Machiavelli. Then he says that it's better to be hated than to be loved. But now I think it's better to be loved than to be hated because I realized that sometimes there's a lot of emotional things going on between professors and students and all these relationships. And sometimes when they come to like what they do, I think it's easier for them to teach. So if they hate me, they hate the content, they start hating and everything. So, but in the beginning, I was not so worried about it. I wanted to present everything as, so that's something that changed.
So that's fascinating. So when you say you were hated, you think that that had anything to do with establishing your authority? Was that how did that manifest? How did that relationship between you and the students come to?
Yeah, in the beginning, I wanted to, yeah, a little bit of establishing authority, but also I wanted to show them to that student. I wanted to show them that you need to work really hard to learn theory. But I still think that you have to work hard to learn theory. But now I also think that you have to like to study theory to learn theory. So that's a little bit of the difference there.
Is there a way that you think that teaching that in the context of Brazil in particular has any uniqueness that you can tap into that helps students, or is it unique to teach theory in Brazil?
I think it's unique to teach theory anywhere because a little bit of what theory means is contextual. But this realization is something that I'm coming to realize day by day. It's not that in the beginning I thought theory was the same everywhere. I thought of science as a being universal kind of framework to look at everything. That wasn't my epistemological standpoint, was more or less like this. And more I realized that we have a little bit of a universal kind of aspiration of being rigorous, being trying not to distort what we see because of our aspirations. But still, I think the place where we are is very important. So always a dialogue between context and an aspiration to find something that's more general that could make sense here in Brazil or in the US or anywhere. But it's always a dynamic process.
So I noticed that your graduate degrees, are also from the University of Brasilia. So I wonder if how you were a student affected how you became a teacher. Another way to say this is, how did your studentness affect your teacherness?
Yes, I think affected a lot, and I, and it started when I was getting my master's degree, and because I'll tell you my experience about a master's degree in the Netherlands when I was there, and my classmates. They were from different countries, like from India, Peru, South Africa, Germany, England, many countries. And we were like a group of more than 20. And we had a lot of readings, a lot of our lecturer was very good, but we didn't have too much time to exchange among ourselves. Plus, the very gray winter in the Netherlands, I started being very depressed. And I started reading Paulo Freire, talking about the course was called Power and Disempowerment. And I started reading Paulo Freire, and he was talking about the pedagogy of the oppressed. And I was feeling oppressed at that time, depressed and oppressed a little bit. And when he was talking about this banking education, how much context was important, and how much teaching and education could be empowering, and I was feeling so disempowered. And part of that was because of the way I was being taught, that didn't allow for much exchange. And the richest part of my learning, that context, was this very diverse environment. And they didn't explore very much that environment. So I decided to write my paper on power and empowerment and teaching, and how much I felt sorry that I didn't have time to have more exchange with my classmates. And so that started changing the whole way I could see teaching and all that. So me being a student that was concerned on my own state of disempowerment, or a little bit of even depression, being depressed by the winter and all that, I think changed, was like made a click inside me. So that was when I was a master student. And in Brazil I did another master, was in international relations, but I was reading on environment studies and all that. And one of the papers I read was also telling that to understand environmental studies, it was important to understand the whole relation with nature, and how much you needed not only intellectual skills but also emotional skills and intuition. And to have a very broad understanding of reality, you had to put together intuition, reason, emotions, and also even your how you relate to nature, your feelings and sensations. And so that also gave me a broader understanding of knowledge. So I put all this together for my teaching. So that's how all this, as a student, influenced my teaching.
I want to talk a little bit about this project that you're working on with the graduate program down there, because I think what you're doing is building in more pedagogy into what the students think that they are becoming as scholars. Can you talk a little bit about the program
Yeah.
or efforts?
Efforts, yes. So far, our efforts. Because of that, all that you said about how important I think teaching is, and how I have come to realize that in our graduate programs in Brazil, I don't know. Also, that's why I asked you also about the US and the world. We don't give too much attention that in how we educate our graduate students. So what I started doing was, every course I teach, either international relations theory or planet politics, I always try to introduce sessions on teaching. Like, for when I taught international relations theory for my graduate students, what I do is every class I do a simulation of them teaching one point on theory. For instance, if the first class is on the debate on realism, for instance, that was my first. So in the end of the class, one of my students has to prepare a class on realism. So we all participate, and so we give him a feedback. So we debate a little bit of how realism is right now, but also how they would teach realism, or liberalism, or whatever. and also now my planet politics class, we had also one session on teaching and how do you teach the Anthropocene and planet politics and pedagogies of hope and all that. But now, as you said, I have this proposal to start having a course on pedagogy and on international relations in the classroom. So I don't
Yeah.
have a degree on pedagogy, but I still can talk about IR in the classroom. So my idea is to have this, and it's still a proposal, has to go through our faculty. Not all of them agree, so I'm not sure if it's going to pass. But if it doesn't work, at least we can have still a workshop or something for a semester to see if it works. And the ideas would be to work how we teach and what we teach, thinking about how we teach IR in the context of Brazil and the Global South.
No, it's fantastic. I, as I think you know, I'm pushing the idea that all doctoral programs should have something formalized about teaching, about pedagogy. And one of the things that I think may be one of the best ways to get voices from the global South into the disciplinary discourse, into the conversation, is at the level of talking about teaching and pedagogy, because it's much more of an even playing field in many ways, because everybody who is a teacher has to try to communicate using the materials that their students already possess.
Yep.
You have to use images and examples and tropes from the culture that really help them understand things.
Yeah.
And everybody has to be creative about that. And the creativity that comes from teachers in contexts that are very different from mine are often some of the best spurs to my own creative imagination about teaching and intersecting with students.
Yes. Yes, I totally agree. And also in countries like Brazil, where inequality and we have a lot of disparities, internal disparities. For instance, we have racial inequality, we have indigenous peoples, and all that. I think starting to think IR in dialogue with these voices is very important. And so my idea would be to have this space within within our graduate program to reflect on how we teach, but also what we teach, and how do we embrace other voices, and how we conceive what international relations is. Because like I like to read fiction to think about. And this during the pandemic when it started, I was reading this book on in Brazil and that tells this story, a fictional story about a girl was enslaved and brought from Africa, from Benin, from what was Benin to Brazil, and was his whole story. And so I came to realize how much we don't know about diaspora and how where all this, that came to be what Brazil is. It's all hidden in our history, so we don't realize how important all this for what Brazil is right now. And so we have to uncover what's hidden in our history, all these voices, and to understand better what IR is or what Brazil is. To understand Brazil, it's so important. So that's why I want to also open this discussion about what we conceive of IR in Brazil. And to listen to this silenced voices is very important, I think. And
Well,
also indigenous peoples as well.
for sure. And one of the best ways to do that is in a classroom where those people are. Even if they're not going to end up as international relations scholars, you can have very interesting conversations with undergraduate students who are there just to take one course or two courses,
Yeah.
because they're bringing this kind of fresh perspective, their perspective into it.
Yeah.
And active learning and the kinds of pedagogies that you're talking about allow those voices to come out.
Yes, definitely. I think my students, they always teach me a lot because they bring these questions. When they question me, wow, why you are teaching, for instance, Wednesday was teaching about epistemic communities and how important these transnational networks of experts were important for environmental policy. And suddenly, when students came to me and said, "Oh, but where are the Brazilian scientists or the other scientists? Are they do they influence?" And I started to think and said, "Oh my God, to what extent?" I'm talking about the transnational networks that perhaps does not include voices, and so I started thinking more, and um, that question came from a student, and so yes, it's definitely this kind of environment brings new questions, new voices, all will, I think, frame my own questions, but also my teaching.
That's fantastic. It's um, the theme of the podcast is to learn something every time you teach. And that I can't think of a better way to wrap things up with them, with the story of you, this questions and ideas from a student influencing how you're thinking about what you're doing. That's great. Um, any last minute little things you wanted to add?
My last lesson would be that we this constant learning is like you learn to do something and suddenly you because of the context you have to change again and move to remote teaching and you have to adapt again. So as I said, it's always a curve, and but that's challenging, but also what makes our profession so fascinating. And so
It's absolutely true. Yes, in fact, I have been telling people that one of the little silver linings of this cloud of the pandemic is that I think I've reestablished a bunch of empathy with my students, because I have been asked to do things that are very difficult for me, that are outside of what I normally do,
yeah,
and to try to do it well, but it's not necessarily always possible. And so that I realize that's what I'm also asking many of my students to do. They're not used to writing a paper like this or participating in a group conversation about something that's very sensitive to them. And I'm asking them to do things that make them uncomfortable, just like the pandemic is asking me to do things that make me uncomfortable.
yes, yes, and this is like always a balance, right? Because sometimes to be uncomfort makes you learn, but sometimes to be uncomfortable blocks you, and you have to be really sensitive and listen a lot. Um, what the students are saying, what they feel, and all that, and so adjust a little bit.
Thank you, Christina, for coming and talking to us about this, and talking especially about how your context of Brazil influences both your image image of the world, but also how how your teaching connects with students who have that same, those different mind frames. That's just fantastic.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Thank you for this opportunity, and I think it's such an important um, initiative to foster it within our community because, as you said, sometimes I was reading the prompt you gave me, and I say I think the common denominator that most of the ISA members were all teachers, and this is sometimes so not marginalized, but people don't give so much importance to it. So
Yeah,
important. Thank you very much for.
thank you. Teaching Curve episodes are available on the Professional Resource Center of the International Studies Association's website and are produced under the auspices of the Innovative Pedagogy Initiative of ISA. If you have comments, questions, or suggestions on who we should interview next, you can reach us on Twitter at Teaching Curve or through email teachingcurve@isanet.org. Thank you very much for tuning in, and remember, learn something every time you teach.